Thanks all you guys for showing out on what looks to be a great day to be on the water. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day. But I think this is a really important topic, and it's a pretty complex topic, so bear with me as I go through a lot of technical jargon and come down to a very basic, simple message, and that is that we have a potential problem, and it could really hurt us in the long run, but we have simple solutions. So my goal is not really to tell you what to do or how to do it. My experience is that shellfish farmers and dealers are some of the most creative people, and fishermen, some of the most creative people on the planet, and if I can just convince you of the issue and the potential hazard to your business, that you guys will find solutions to this issue yourself. The idea is that we really just are trying to help you protect your business and your markets by reducing illnesses. And the biggest challenge, I recognize that the people who are turning out on a day like today are probably some of the most conscientious people in the industry. I'm not really that concerned. You guys are probably already doing this stuff as a matter of routine. But our industry is really only as strong as the weakest link, and we need creative solutions to try and raise the bar and bring those who are probably a little bit less conscientious about how they handle their shellfish into the modern day. This is no longer acceptable. We all have to be doing it right and doing it well. So how we get these people to clean up their act, that is the biggest challenge. So here's what we're here to talk about, a really boring subject, Vibrio bacteria. These are naturally occurring bacteria that are not associated with sewage or pollution. The two main ones we're concerned about with are vulnificus and parahemolyticus. Related to a third type of Vibrio that you've all heard of called cholera, which is sewage related, more often seen down in South America where sewage treatment is not adequate. Although I had 2 cases of Vibrio cholera show up in the pond where I grew oysters for 22 years. 2 meatheads were recreationally harvesting soft-shell clams, threw them in their trunk and drove around the state for a few hours and went home, ate the soft-shell clams and came down with cholera, which would have been an outbreak, but thankfully, because they recognized that this was a case of meatheads acting stupidly and not necessarily a severe health risk to common sense harvesters, they didn't shut me down. But it just goes to show you that these hazards do exist if we don't treat our product correctly. So they're found in all coastal waters when warm, especially this is the vulnificus. It's more of a problem down south. But we don't know how many cells it takes to make you sick. We're not sure if there are benign and virulent strains. We're not sure whether it can be controlled through high salinity, although a lot of people are experimenting with that right now. There's a lot of things we don't know about these things. It's a very rare illness. Most doctors in the U.S. have never seen a case of Vibrio vulnificus. 90 cases in the U.S. from all causes. It's only really a serious issue for those who are immune compromised. And you're going to hear me say this a lot, so I'm going to go over it pretty thoroughly. What immune compromise means are those people with liver failure, diabetes, they might be on steroids for a medical condition, they might have had an organ transplant and they're on drugs to suppress their immune response, something along those lines. A lot of people are not aware that they are immune compromised. Maybe their doctor didn't point out to them that they've got diabetes or that they've been drinking in excess their whole lives. But these people become very seriously ill, and half of the infections from vulnificus are from wound infections. The other half are related to shellfish consumption. And here's the kicker. Half of them are fatal. And they're fatal very quickly, and it's a gruesome way to go. If you go on the websites for those who would have us sterilize all our oysters, like CSBI came out with a news release just yesterday. If you go on their website and click through, you'll see pictures of people with skin lesions that are enough to horrify you. It's a terrible, terrible disease, but it's incredibly rare. And we have about 12 to 15 deaths a year associated with Vibrio vulnificus from shellfish. It kills our markets. Every time somebody gets ill, the price of lobster in Maine drops. The consumers hear about it, and it lands us in the crosshairs of the regulators and in these groups who put out the 10 deadliest foods list. This is not great for our industry in any way. So for any state that has had 2 or more reported VV illnesses related to shellfish since 1995, you have to instate a plan to reduce illness by 60% over 6 years, and that plan can entail several different factors. Education of the at-risk population, telling them they shouldn't be eating raw shellfish, or for that matter, any raw protein at all, but especially raw shellfish in summer. Shortening the time to temperature. So many states, especially in the South, have gone to 5 hours time to harvest. So from the time that you hit the water to the time that you pull your stuff in can be no more than 5 hours during the heat of summer. Other options include seasonal closures, shucking, labeling your product for cook only, sending it to a shucking house, or post-harvest processing it. Now, post-harvest processing can be a number of different procedures. Gamma irradiation, there's a pasteurization, a low temperature pasteurization, which I think is 140 degrees for 6 hours. It's a patented process. I think it's called the AmeriPure process. There's a very intense freezing process. It's more intense than just an IQF tunnel. It's very cold for a sustained time. And there's a high pressure device that you can buy for about $3 million that will kill all the bacteria. All of these, with the exception of low gamma, leave you with a dead product, dead meat on a shell, which I think is a serious issue, which I'm going to get into. So just to point out that while we usually think of Vibrio vulnificus as a Gulf Coast issue, it is in all of our waters. They've been sampling up in the Piscataway in Maine and find high levels of Vibrio vulnificus in August, levels that should be making people sick right and left. So we're not quite sure why they haven't had many illnesses, or any, that have been traced to those waters. But it's a curious phenomenon. We had a death to Vibrio vulnificus in Rhode Island. A commercial digger had a wound infection. He was immune compromised, and about 48 hours later he passed. A lot of people have probably experienced fish poisoning, get a fish spine. Oftentimes that is a Vibrio vulnificus infection or a related Vibrio. So it's a potential issue in our waters. We don't see much of it, but there have been some in Long Island Sound, and it can be a problem. So I'd love to tell you that you don't have a problem, and we haven't had any illnesses related to Massachusetts shellfish, but it may just be a matter of time. Our coastal waters are warming up with global warming, a couple degrees. I think it's something we need to have on our radar screen. Well, Vibrio parahemolyticus is much more serious. It sickens several thousand people each year. It's more common in the high salinity water as opposed to the vulnificus, which is in the low salinity water. And it's common in our waters when the temperatures are over 75 degrees. The illnesses are more severe in immune-compromised individuals again, but no mortalities that I'm aware of have been associated with Vibrio parahemolyticus alone. The infectious dose is known. It's really hard to get people to volunteer for a test study on Vibrio vulnificus because if you catch it, half of them are fatal. So I've participated in a study for Vibrio parahemolyticus where we sent my oysters down to be intentionally infected and then fed to prisoners so they could figure out what the infectious dose is. You can't get people to do that for VV, but so we do have a pretty good handle on the infectious dose. It's about 50,000 cells maybe, somewhere in that neighborhood, 10,000 cells. We do know that there are benign and infectious strains of VP. So if you go out and you measure total VP, you're measuring a whole suite of animal bacteria, some of which will make you sick and some of which will have no impact on you. We know that the East Coast problem is a little bit different than the West Coast problem. They tend to have more percentage of virulence in their, and they tend to have less of a correlation with temperature. They've seen problems all the way up into Alaska, a couple of outbreaks coming out of there. And then they discovered, well, we're having these problems. If we hang the oysters for a couple days below the thermocline, we don't have these problems, and that's pretty much solved their problem. And here's the kicker. The doubling time for VP is 1 hour at 90 degrees. So an oyster can come out of the water and be perfectly safe, and in a short period of time, if it's at a high temperature, it can become a problem. But once you get it down below 45 degrees, growth stops. So it's a proven effective way to deal with preventing illness. And we also know that temperature abuse is still a problem in our industry. And there are some cases where their levels at harvest might be high enough to cause illness, especially if you're harvesting, say, intertidally on a hot sunny day where the oysters have been out for a few hours baking in the sun. That can be a problem, but it's rarely a problem this far north, right out of the water. And here's an illustration of part of the problem. If you look at very high temperatures, very rapid, very short time to double. If you get it down, you know, it takes 35 hours for that bacteria to double. So if you're starting with an animal that's got a couple hundred cells in it, and suddenly it's doubled a few times, it can become a problem. But if you can get that down a few degrees, here's another way of illustrating it, and this is one of those where a picture tells 1,000 words. You know, if you're starting out with 8 colonies and a gram of oyster meat at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, you end up with 13 after 6 hours. But if you're out there and that animal, those oysters are sitting on the deck in the sun and it gets up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're out there harvesting for maybe 6 hours, those 8 bacteria have just grown to 512. Now that's a problem. Now you've got a shellfish that went from being perfectly safe to this is a potential time bomb. That's what we're here trying to spread the word. That's why I'm going up and down the coast. I've been in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Connecticut, and I'm hitting every East Coast state trying to spread the word that this is a simple problem to control. And here's the kicker. In states that have had, once you've had 2 illnesses to VP in a 3-year period, or 1 outbreak, which is defined as 2 people getting sick from the same batch of shellfish, or if your average water temperature exceeds 81 degrees, which is everywhere south of New Jersey, then you have to institute control measures. And these control measures are similar to the ones in the VV control plan that I talked about: post-harvest processing closures, labeling for cook only, limiting time to refrigeration. And down in the Gulf, they actually limit time to refrigeration down to 1 hour in an attempt to control Vibrio vulnificus. That means that they had to put refrigeration units out on the boats at great expense, or other measures based on studies. So I just threw a lot of information at you real quick, and I'm going to pause for a second right here before I get into the politics of this issue and see if anybody's got any questions about what I just threw out there.
When you say post-harvest, that's assuming I think you mentioned something like that. You know, sometimes we're taking them off the grant, but they might have already been dry for 2 or 3 hours, something like that. How much does it affect the bacteria growth if, let's say you have a place on your lease where you could actually keep the things under the water until, I mean, the bacteria is still present.
Right.
And on the flats, particularly in places like Brewster and Dennis, that water sometimes will go high as 70 degrees or more.
Yep.
Are you doing any better, or do you still have the same issues?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And the differentiation is once the oyster closes up and stops pumping, then the dynamics of the bacteria inside change. The bacteria, when the oyster's continually filtering, it sort of reaches an equilibrium with the water. The bacteria that pass into the gut get digested just like any other food. The bacteria that's on the outside of the tissue and just sort of hanging out on the gill and around the mantle, that is coming and going and sloughing and reattaching as the animal filters and pumps. As soon as the animal stops pumping because it's out of the water, it clams up. And the stuff that's in the gut will digest, but the stuff that's outside is just going to start to multiply and grow. So if you put it back in the water, that whole process will start to re-equilibrate, and you'll come back into a stasis, if you will, a level that the animal would have been if he was, you know, right out of the water. It might take several hours for those numbers to drop, but or you know, 24 hours, or you know, come back the next day. I think that's a great approach, personally. Was there another question? Yeah.
Once you reach this 512 level at 90 degrees, what's the best approach to get rid of that, bring those numbers back down, short of either heating or freezing the animal to death?
Yeah, I mean, if you've got severely temperature-abused animals and you're concerned that the levels might be very high, you know, I'd consider putting them back on the lease if you have that option. If you're a grower and you have a lease, and you know, but there are specific rules for wet storage, specific permits that you would need to get, and I'm going to be getting into that a little later.
At least for how long, would you say? Or how many tide cycles?
You know, 24 hours ought to be enough to re-equilibrate the animal. If they're in a tray where they're able to open up and pump, no more than 2 or 3 animals deep. If they're in a sack and there's not good water flow, it's not going to help. And it's also a problem for clams. We hear mostly about oysters being a problem, but we've had recently a bunch of illnesses were reported related to clams and VP. The reason it's more of a problem with an oyster is an oyster pumps more water and it has a finer gill. So it's able to capture a small particle, like a bacteria. These are very small particles, so it will capture more than a clam and concentrate more. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, John Chimatara from Legal Seafoods in Boston. And I just had a question. You had mentioned how Vibrio, I believe, Analyticus stopped growing at 45 degrees. Now, is there a point at which that growth will actually reverse and you'll see death in that bacteria? Like if we have a dry storage in our facility at 38 degrees and ice down.
There is some evidence that Vibrio vulnificus and Vibrio perihemolyticus do start to drop after a period of time in cold storage. But maybe Mike has got a better handle on that.
It's low temperatures in a long time, so then the game that you're playing is de-ages the shellfish and conditioning the shellfish. So that may actually work against you in the long run.
All right, I'm going to keep going here and get into the politics and why this is, I believe, a very important issue for our industry and what happened in the last year from the FDA. So going back into history a little bit, the Gulf had been having quite a challenge with Vibrio vulnificus illnesses, and they were under a timetable to achieve a 60% reduction in illness, and basically had not really achieved the milestones that we had hoped that they would. The FDA came out with a computer, a table, a risk calculator that allowed us to predict, you know, what would happen if we went to 1 hour to refrigeration. Well, that should achieve the reduction in illness target of 60%. I think that last year they got to 48% reduction in illness was reported at the BOD, sort of preliminary data. So they were close, but they were still a ways away, and they agreed to implement this. But then when the ISSC convened last October, the FDA came in and proclaimed that they no longer believed that this 1 hour to refrigeration would be an effective approach. And worse, they felt that there was an alternative that was proven, and that was post-harvest processing. So they revealed that they were going to ban basically all raw oysters out of the Gulf states. They were going to require post-harvest processing of all this product, or shucking of all Gulf product essentially from April to November. And this was to be implemented in May of 11. Well, why? This is always an interesting question. New administration and new leadership, and there's this new national ethic that's coming about where Americans don't seem to want to take responsibility for their own actions. They expect government to protect them, and the patriarchal government attitude in response that anyone stupid enough to expose themselves to any kind of risk should be protected from that, you know, whether it's the seatbelt law or the helmet law, or, you know, in this case, the move to sterilize shellfish. It's coming in our society at one level or another. And I actually heard Mike Taylor say this in his office as an FDA. If we can prevent one illness, we must at any cost. And our industry, let's face it, we have a challenging history to overcome. 100 years ago, when they invented the flush toilet and hadn't figured out how to do sewage treatment, we got thousands of people sick and huge epidemics up and down the coast in every major city. And that legacy lives on. So, you know, we have this challenging history that we have to overcome. And the response of the ISSC to this FDA mandate, they wanted us to scrap the plans to go to 1 hour refrigeration in the Gulf. The ISSC Board of Directors said, well, we think that would be bad for the industry. We decided to, the industry pushed forth with the plans to continue to implement these refrigeration units on the boats at great expense, even though they recognize that a year later they might not be able to sell a raw oyster at all, and they might as well just let them be full of bacteria when they hit the beach, since they're going to be post-harvest processed anyway. So we felt that they deserved a shot at proving this 1 hour refrigeration. We established a huge press blitz, a lot of websites, petitions, got a lot of publicity, some fantastic press articles. Several bills were submitted in the House to strip the FDA of funds to enforce this new edict, to do more education and force them to do a cost analysis. Typically, when you pass a new regulation, you have to do a cost analysis and go out to public comment. The FDA snuck this through by doing a change in the HACCP guidance, technically not a regulatory change, so they figured we don't need to do a cost analysis, we don't need to do go to public comment, we're just going to push this through. We sent them a pretty clear message. There was a very contentious hearing in the House. They were asked some tough questions by House members, and they backed down. They delayed implementation, promised to do a cost analysis, and increased dialogue with industry. I don't think this really changes a damn thing. They're going to continue to push forward with this strategy, as far as I can tell. We did, and this is rather enlightening and scary to us, we did a Freedom of Information Act request to see, as they were developing this mandate that they came out with for Vibrio vulnificus, were they considering doing it with Vibrio parahemolyticus? And sure enough, right up until 2 days before they made the announcement, they were considering pushing through a similar regulation for any states with Vibrio parahemolyticus issues. Well, that draws in the entire East Coast. Most of us have had at least 1 or 2 illnesses with VP, or will in the next few years. They had detailed documents to explain their rationale, and this was going to be implemented in 2012. For whatever reason, they decided to limit it to VV, vulnificus in the Gulf. And they most recently came out with a statement that admitted that there are other states other than just the Gulf states that have had 2 VV illnesses and will be in this club with forced PHP and shucking and seasonal closures. So what are some of the impacts that this ban, this guidance would have had? Well, most states have had some issues. This machinery that you need to get to do post-harvest processing is out of reach for most of the industry. A $3 million device to do pressure shocking, some of these patented processes, they're very expensive. And my feeling is that a raw bar is not going to serve dead meat in a shell. They're going to either go out of business or they're going to replace your product with a Canadian product or something else. And my feeling is that post-harvest processing doubles the cost and kills the value. for our industry at least, especially in New England where most of our product is served in raw bars. And I was very scared to hear that they wanted to include VP, because I think a lot of states are very close to being in the list of having to have VP considered. So it's a very slippery slope when the FDA starts to mandate elimination of all risk and we end up with sterilized products. But I've been seeing discussions relating to, from the FDA, talking about sterilizing greens after the spinach outbreak. So, I mean, this sort of thinking is out there and we need to be aware. So my major concern, and this is where I start to really get scared, is I think that once we start mandating sterilizing all our shellfish, that we're opening the door to nations that are able to import a sterilized product that's been grown in less than sanitary conditions, perhaps. And if you go to the Boston Seafood Show, you can already see clams up there for 8 cents. Cooked clams, beautiful product, oysters for a dime. And if we're forced to compete with that, sterilized shellfish from Asia, sterilized shellfish from the Cape, I don't think that the restaurants are going to care. They'll go for the cheaper product and we'll be out of business. I believe that our only true market advantage is that we can serve a fresh live shellfish. And if we lose that, I believe we run the risk of losing that market if we can't keep our products safer. So we've been working with the Gulf and West Coast industry associations. We have to have a consistent message that our product is still the safest shellfish on the planet, and we continue to work hard to improve our safety record. We have been doing a steady education process for our legislators, emphasizing the jobs and economic development, the importance of this industry to our economy. You can go to our website and see some sample letters, background information, sign the petition. But, you know, what we can't do is just put our heads down and say we don't have a problem. We'll hope that it's just going to go away. And here's another thing that doesn't work. You can say that chicken, salmonella from chicken sickens thousands of people a year and kills 500 a year. Why do they care about 12 people? You know, you're not going to get traction. We only kill 12. Well, that's great. You know, no, that's not going to do it either. And I hear this a lot, especially in New England, that if somebody gets sick from a shellfish that was tagged in the New England waters, they assume that it was mislabeled product. Somebody taking perhaps Gulf Coast product, slapping a New England tag on it to increase the price and then shipping it out. And while we know that that does occur, it can occur, and that I really strongly recommend that if you know of anybody who's doing this, you got to put some peer pressure on them and try and get them to stop, or drop a dime on them and get it stopped, because this will end up shutting your waters, and it will end up putting those illnesses on your state, which will land you in the club of having to have a VP control plan, shorter times to refrigeration, and things like that. So I think that, you know, we need to clamp down on tag fraud, but to say that all cases that land on your state are due to tag fraud, I think is perhaps sticking your head in the sand, because I think that there are some cases that we are having in New England. So, and this is where I'm getting involved in this process. I think we've got some relatively simple solutions to keeping our shellfish from getting people sick, to Vibrios at least. And so I'm going up and down the coast with this aggressive education plan. We've developed some brochures here. They're over by the door. And I'm really trying to work on getting you guys to apply the peer pressure to make our industry more professional and really keep us in business. So what are some of the things we can do? Well, keep it in the water until the last minute. If you're harvesting intertidally, if you can, you know, put it in a cage, trays, so that it can still breathe, leave it in the water overnight. And this is key, shade in the boat and on the truck. And by that, I don't mean wrapping it in a tarp. That just makes it into a pressure cooker. You can actually cook food under a dark tarp in the sun. I'm talking about shade with an airspace underneath, an awning, something on your boat or your truck. We've shown that some studies were done in New Jersey. That'll drop 10 degrees right there. just simply going to shade. Most states south of New Jersey have mandated shade on the boats. This is something we can do ourselves before it gets mandated. You can toss ice on the oysters. Sometimes some people say you have to temper your clams. I don't think that's usually an issue up here. In some of the southern states, if you take a clam right out of the water and throw it on ice, it'll have a short shelf life. I'm not aware of that being a problem up here. Have you guys who work with clams had a problem with icing clams right out of the water? Anybody? I didn't think so. Spraying it with cool water from an approved source when you hit the beach, that's a great thing to do. Get it to the cooler as fast as possible. And make sure you educate your dealer and your trucker that they don't leave it outside in the sun. They move it into the cooler as quick as possible. Start that chilling process as fast as we can. If we can just knock it down 10 degrees right on the boat with a bucket of ice, it's going to start that process of keeping it from getting to be a real problem. If you're icing in a container, make sure it's got drainage. You don't want to have it sitting in the ice melt water at the bottom. That's critical. They will open up and start to suck that nasty water. That's no good either. Shade, as I said, is really key. Ice from approved sources. There are some studies that show that you can grow bacteria in an ice machine. I'm not aware of ones where you can grow pathogens, ones that actually get people sick. So if I had a choice between using unapproved ice or letting my shellfish bake in the sun, I'm not going to tell you should violate your regulations, but it's an option. Vibrio vulnificus cases, if you get 2 of these or 3 parahemolyticus cases, then you're not going to have a choice. You will be forced to have a shorter harvest day. You will be facing stringent regulations. You can talk to your state regulators about possible wet storage options. If you're an aquaculturist, you're basically doing wet storage anyway, just growing it on the lease. So holding your animals on the lease is essentially something you're already approved to do. But if you don't have a lease, you can probably talk to your state regulators about in-water wet storage permits. There's also on-land wet storage permits. They're much more challenging to get. Lots of sampling that you'd have to do, special filtration. It's not rocket science. It can be done, but it's not easy. Be creative, you know, ice, coolers, shade. One thing, they did a study in New Jersey, I was talking about the shade. They also looked at a swamp cooler, which is where you spray a mist of just seawater and allow the evaporative cooling to, and when it's 100-degree humidity, which it frankly is most of August, you don't get any evaporation, so you don't get any cooling effect. In fact, seawater will sometimes suck moisture out of the air. So they discovered less than 2 degrees advantage to the swamp cooler misting. But I'm sure you guys, if you think about it, there's refrigerated seawater systems for lobster tanks. We can be creative in a number of different ways. So we're going up and down the coast. If you haven't got one of these brochures that we've been developing, we're giving these to growers and harvesters all up and down the coast. We're developing there's also a brochure here for truckers. I think we ran out of these, but I'll give some more to Bill and Diane. They can get them out to you guys. It's just 5 simple steps. Hand it to the truck driver. Make sure he knows that it's not okay to leave the reefer unit off. It's not okay to leave the door open for hours when there's shellfish in there. This is food, and it's going to become an unsafe product if we don't handle it right. And frankly, we know from FDA data that somewhere along the supply chain it's not being handled right. The data suggests that between harvest and retail, the numbers of Vibrio are going up by 2 logs. In other words, 1 cell is becoming 100. 100 cells is becoming 10,000 between harvest and retail. So somewhere along the line, somebody's screwing up, and we can't tolerate that anymore. This is easy to fix. It's just keep it cool. It's a simple message. So here's some data that came out of Rhode Island last summer. Marta Gomez-Chari working on a grant that we got through the ISSC to try and differentiate between the different strains of my view is we shouldn't be looking at total Vibrio parahemolyticus if some of the strains are not getting people sick. All we really care about the ones that are getting people sick. So 3 different strains here, TLH positive, TRH positive, TDH positive, that are associated with illnesses. And these are the levels, and you can see that come August, we get this spike in our water. So going from 1 cell to 10 cells to 100 cells to 1,000 cells to 10,000 cells. We're getting up there for a period, you know, late July through August, maybe the first week of September. We've got some potential problems. Now these oysters coming right out of the water are probably safe. And this is from the risk calculator that came from the FDA, which you can get online. It talks about, and this is dose level, so log 6, that's 6 zeros after your number. You're starting to get a 50% probability of illness for consumption when you eat 50,000 cells. So for this study, the study that I just showed you here, these numbers, this was a farm in Narragansett Bay, and there was 4 other sites that were studied. I just didn't want to show you too many different plots, but it's all relatively similar in the coastal ponds. These numbers were coming in right about here, which was about a 1% risk of illness. But if the oysters are not chilled, then this risk multiplies. So, and I sort of question this because I know that Rhode Island serves a lot of oysters in summer, and we had no reported illnesses that I'm aware of. So perhaps the calculator is not perfect, but you know, if that's telling you you've got a 1% risk of oysters of illness, and you serve 1,000 oysters, you should at least get a couple illnesses. So it's not perfect, but and these oysters also were chilled right out of the water. They were harvested, taken out of the water, and put in a cooler and taken to the lab. It's not like where you would harvest for several hours, perhaps in the sun, and it'd take a while. Mike, you had a question?
Yeah, more of a comment, if you don't mind, and maybe try to explain that number in the FDA risk calculator. It's one of the reasons why ISSC didn't adopt it, was the fact that FDA's intention is that many of the VP cases go unreported. And this is data that they get from CDC. And there's a lot of disagreement on what the actual case law is in a year in terms of, say, what's reported and what isn't reported. FDA's calculator factors in a huge number of supposedly unreported cases, which sometimes doesn't sit well with, say, the observed information like which you're referring to in Rheault. I guess the contention seems to be that people get, mildly ill and just don't pursue it, so it doesn't get into the statistics system.
The whole question of reporting the illnesses is part of the reason why we're under the microscope now, is because recently, in the last 6 years, I believe, Vibrio became a reportable illness. And so the health departments of each state are supposed to, if they get a severe case of gastroenteritis, they're supposed to culture it out and see if it's Vibrio parahemolyticus, if it's one of those strains, and then report it to the CDC. Now, some states are doing a much better job of it than others. We just had some documents that came out of the Board of Directors meeting. I mentioned the VP in clams, and I think there were 71 illnesses reported, and 50 of them came from New York. Well, you could say, well, gee, New York has a real problem. Well, these oysters and clams came from all over the country in Canada. So what it really is that New York's just doing a better job of reporting, and the other states haven't caught up yet. So when our states catch up, I think you're going to find that there will be more illnesses reported in your state. Now that this has become a reportable illness, the hospitals and health departments are starting to do more follow-up and reporting. It just raises the element of risk that you're going to land in the troop of people who have to have a VP plan. Okay, so I already mentioned this, that you know, the FDA data shows that somewhere between harvest and retail, these numbers are going up, and it's not acceptable. When we met, about a dozen industry leaders met in January with Mike Taylor in his opulent new headquarters in Silver Spring there. I saw no indication that they're backing down at all. There's sort of a delay tactic, lots of discussion about dialogue, but I see this as a freight train that's going to be very difficult to steer away from, and yet I also see this as an opportunity for us to really clean up our act and continue to work on improving our record of having the best shellfish on the planet. So the FDA has, you know, made some concessions, and interestingly, they came out very recently and stated that they are not considering mandating post-harvest processing to control VP currently. It gives me absolutely no confidence that they won't change their mind again tomorrow. The day before, or 2 days before the ISSC meeting, they clearly were considering it. So, okay, they're not considering it now. We managed to get an amendment into the Food Safety Act that went through recently, that before the FDA can change the guidance on their HACCP, they have to actually do an economic impact study. That's a small, you know, small thing for them to do. They're theoretically doing their economic impact study now, but all that data is going to be totally bollocksed up by the oil spill in the Gulf. So, what else can we do? Well, certainly there's a lot of things we don't know. Depuration methods that are perhaps being used in Japan or in Europe that we could be looking into. I've got a guy who's looking at a small business innovative research grant to look at ozone to cut down on VP numbers. It would need to be validated through the ISSC, several-year process before it could be adopted, but we need to start this stuff. We need answers that will cut down on bacteria levels and virus illnesses that will leave us the opportunity to sell a fresh live oyster during the summer months. We need better tools so we can tell what's in the water and get that answer before we ship the product out the door. We're working on developing a rapid dipstick test that you could have so that you could know that you don't have a problem before you send that product out the door, so that we're not always in the position of reacting to an illness and the bad press that comes with it. We need to know if some of these depuration treatments or other treatments might work to cut down on numbers reliably, quickly, and effectively. Spread the word, you know, invite your local and state representatives to come down to your farm, to your fish market. Tell them about the importance of your industry to your economy, to your community, and what would something like this do if they were to mandate post-harvest processing. Just start the education process, please.
You mentioned rapid testing. How close are we, and how can I find information about that rapid testing? Currently, we use a method that takes a minimum of 48 hours to confirm Vibrio.
Yeah, qPCR is and it usually involves a culture step. In other words, you blend up the oyster meat, you toss it into an incubation, you amplify the numbers of bacteria, and then you run it through a PCR to look for the DNA of the species of bacteria that you're looking for. It takes 48 hours. There's a device that DuPont puts out that'll do it pretty much automatically. It's a $50,000 device, $2 a sample. We'll test for VV, VP, Noro, and a dozen other things and give you an answer in 48 hours, as you said. 48 hours is, you know, from the time it hits the dock to the time it gets to the consumer, at least you're able to do a recall before it's gotten out too far into the distribution chain. I think that's about as good as it gets so far. Like I say, through the ECSJ, we've solicited research dollars from Congress, appropriation earmarks, and we're starting that process. It's a ways away. I can talk to you after about, you know, how we can work together to continue that. Yeah.
A quick thing on that process in our lab, those screening methods, they are up and coming, but they're not, like you said, validated.
Right.
And we get a lot more false positives. And then when you try to culture, it's all negative. So you really don't want to be adding and pulling on screening methods right now that are not good.
No, it's absolutely true. And the DuPont, the Omicron, it only measures total. It's not differentiating between the benign strains and the pathogenic strains. So we're in discussions with them to develop the primers necessary to tease out the different strains of VP. And there's some other confusing factors. There's a non-TDH, non-TRH positive or negative that seems to get people sick. There's still so much work that needs to be done. We've got some top-notch work going on. The USDA lab, the Dauphin Island lab in Alabama, other labs up and down the coast. There's a conference in Mississippi for 5 days on this subject. So we need to continue to do more work on this. But everybody needs to be aware of the FDA's view on this and what it could do to their industry. And, you know, get involved with your industry association on the state level and the national level. And think about how we can work together to apply peer pressure to those who may not be as conscientious as the people in this room. It's the lowest denominator, the weakest link in the chain that's going to drag you down and land you in a heap of trouble. So if you can't, you know, if you can talk to people that you know are harvesting on a Sunday and holding it in their garage until the dealer opens on a Monday, you know, if you can't have an impact and change their behavior, it's time to think about dropping a dime and getting Mike or one of the Hickeys involved and, you know, clean up the show here. This is our industry. We need to be professionals and make sure that this industry is still around for a long time to come. And that's all I've got to say. If you have any questions, you want to contact me. These are some great websites, safeoysters.org, the ECSGA website. We've got a lot of information.